room. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Sunday School after a summer break of a few weeks. We're very pleased this morning to be joined by the Reverend Dr. Lisa Davison, who will be very soon the official dean at Phillips Theological Seminary. Pleased to have Lisa here, especially given you have a very, very, very busy schedule. And so, like many things, when you agree to stuff, it's like months ahead of time, and then you're like, oh yeah, I got all this time. I'll agree, I'll do that. And then you don't. So thank you for being here. We're very happy to have you here, and really happy to explore an interesting topic. This is the person to hear about this topic from. So we're really lucky to have her. And so we'll welcome Lisa for her discussion, which will go on for the next, for the next 4 weeks. So this is part one of 4. A little reminder, as we're doing things, we are recording this for later transmission. So if you have questions, which I would assume Lisa will say anytime you have a question, or there'll be some time at the end for some Q&As. Anytime you have a question, let's please be sure to seek out this microphone to ask your question into, so that the people who will watch this later on the video will hear your question. Okay? Lisa.
Everyone should be able to hear me now without me using my youth ministry voice. Good morning. Thank you all for being here so early on a Sunday, and I thank Justin for the invitation and Chris for the introduction. When Justin contacted me, he said, I know you're really busy and you probably don't want to take on another thing. But when he talked about doing something with the women in the Hebrew Bible, I said, sure, I can do that, because I can talk for hours without even preparing. So it wasn't such a big thing at that point, and it still isn't. Things are crazy busy at the seminary. We're starting our 3rd week. And as you may know, our president, Dr. Nancy Pittman, is retiring at the end of September. We will have an interim, Reverend Gary Kidwell, who will begin on October 1st. I'm being installed on the 16th, and we are searching for a Hebrew Bible professor because, surprise, surprise, I can't do it all. I cannot teach all of that. So we are very busy at the seminary. We're also beginning some reflections on imagining curriculum in a new way for a new day, given that the church is not the same as when I went to seminary in '88, nor even when I began teaching in '96, or even when I came to Phillips in 2010. Things are always changing. So there's going to be some things happening. You may have heard as well that we're building a place. We call it the Lodge right now. It's not a good name. But it will have hotel-style rooms and gathering space and kitchen and actually a catering kitchen that we hope will be good for our students who come in from far distances to have a safe, clean place to stay, as well as to hang out with other students, because right now our students go to hotels or a monastery or something like that. This will give them one common space to share while they're in Tulsa for a concentrated course. So lots happening at the seminary. But that's not why I'm here today. I am here to talk about rowdy broads of the Hebrew Bible. I need to say a word. Broads sometimes has been a negative term, but it's not for me. When I call someone a broad, it means that this person has courage, is not afraid to do what needs to be done, and also is confident in who they are and what they're here to do. So broad is not a negative. Now, pushy women is our first group today. And this word pushy, again, is what others might call these women. Not necessarily what I would call them, but often they are called pushy, how it goes today. Women often will be called pushy, and men who do the same thing are called bold or courageous or a leader. And so that's kind of how I think about these. Before we begin, I want to do a couple of background things for you to think about. And also wanted to follow up with what Chris said. If you have a question along the way, please raise your hand, because if I'm not stopped, I will run all the way through. And I have a group of women this week. Next week we'll do a different group, and on down the line. So one thing happens when I study the Hebrew Bible with students is we ask the question, where are the women? Where are the women in the Bible? Of the 3,100 proper names in the Protestant canon, both Testaments, only 170 are women's names. So that tells you a little bit about what we're dealing with. The majority of these named women appear in the Hebrew Bible, not in the New Testament. So that's why it's so fun to study the women of the Hebrew Bible. According to one accounting that used an English translation, not the original Hebrew, only 93 women speak in the Bible, a total of 14,056 words, which is about 1.1%. So that tells you a few things. Names don't show up. Usually women are known either by their husband or their son or their father, or they're known by their location, where they came from. Think of Queen of Sheba, even Bathsheba. Though we have those names, Bathsheba, it literally means daughter of Sheba. So it's kind of a created name. So when we find women who are named, when we find women who speak, even if they're not named, we want to pay close attention. Something's going on that the writers who preferred to follow the male story could not ignore this female character in order to silence her. And there are theories that some of the words attributed to male characters in the Bible were originally attributed to female characters. But the editors didn't want to give women that much freedom of speech, and so they often rearranged those words. Another reason why I think it's important to identify named women, women who speak, and to remember those unnamed women has to do with Christian history. Our church fathers, which to me is not my favorite term, I'm not thinking of them as a father figure, I think of them as other things. They had a lot to say about women. Tertullian in the 2nd and 3rd century wrote, "Woman is a temple built over a sewer, the gateway to the devil. Woman, you are the devil's doorway. You should always go in mourning and in rags." So think about that. Now, where are they getting these ideas of women? Some of it comes from the Bible. Most of it, I think, comes from culture. St. Thomas Aquinas, who's one of my favorite saints, if you call them that, wrote this in the 13th century. "As regards the individual nature, woman is defective and misbegotten, for the active force in the male seed tends to the production of a perfect likeness in the masculine sex, while the production of woman comes from a defect in the active force or from some material indisposition or even from some external influence." So right there, you get this idea that every baby was intended to be a man, and then something wrong happened, and it ended up as a female. Now, I often wonder what would have happened to us if all babies had been born men and male, and then we would have never gotten beyond the garden. And then Martin Luther, us Protestants sometimes like to say, well, the Protestants don't think that way. Martin Luther wrote in the 15th, 16th century, "If they, women, become tired or even die, that does not matter. Let them die in childbirth. That's why they are there." Now, I'm already in trouble. I mean, I'm out of the whole picture because I don't have children. So, I don't even count. So with that in mind, we're going to look at these women, and we want to think about some key concepts. The first is we often see in stories people who have power that we use as a broad term to talk about people in power. I think there's a difference between people's power and people's authority. So I think everybody has a bit of power, some people less than others. But power is the ability to affect change or control a situation. Authority, though, is the recognized and authorized power to change a situation. And usually authority is limited to very few, back in biblical times as well as today. And so many women have power, but they don't have authority. And so when we look at these women and they do some questionable things that offend our piety of 21st century, we have to remember that if they had authority, they could have handled things differently. But because they had power, they didn't have authority and only power, they had to do whatever they could to make change, to save themselves, their children, or the entire Israelite people. Most of the biblical text is androcentric, male-focused. So as I tell folks, if you look at Sunday school curriculum, if you look at Intro to the Hebrew Bible or Intro to the Bible textbooks, they follow male characters all the way through. We are supposed to watch the male characters. It takes an act of will to follow the female characters because they aren't the center of attention. And so when I teach women in the Hebrew Bible for seminary students, we just do the whole of the Hebrew canon as a storyline, but we follow all the female characters there. There's a little debate about whether what we see in the Hebrew Bible is a patriarchal society, which really is that father household. There are some arguments that it might have been a little less patriarchal in some of those stories that seem to reflect a pre-urbanized Israel, where everybody lived in agricultural context in which every person was valued. But I still think overall, the male household, the father's house, as is often used in the Hebrew text, is the dominant force. Patrilineal means that in that storyline of the Hebrew Bible, inheritance went only to sons. And so if a father didn't have sons, it would go back to his brothers. And if there weren't any brothers, it'd go back to his uncles if his dad was no longer around, and on down the line. Now, there is one story in the Hebrew Bible that we will look at in which that pattern is changed. And then also, patrilocal is how we describe the marriage customs that are reflected in the stories of the Hebrew Bible, which means when a couple comes together and then they go live with the husband's family. So it's important to remember this because reading through the Hebrew Bible, you think, oh, they don't love their daughters. But the pattern means that when you have a son, the son will stay in your house and build up your house by marrying and raising children. But if you have a daughter, she's going to go away. She will go to someone else's house and build it up. So that's why there is some, less favor given to daughters because you know they're on their way out as soon as they're born. Now, there are a couple of places in the Hebrew Bible that sounds like matrilocal marriage, and we'll look at those too, where instead the husband leaves and comes to the wife's family home and they build up the wife's home. But that's only in a couple of places. And I don't know if I have this in a slide, I'll say something about that in a minute, but just remember, women, typically the female characters have limited power and rarely have authority. The other thing I was going to say is in Hebrew, there is no separate word for husband or for wife. The word used is ish for a man, isha for a woman, and that is used when we read husband and wife. It's the exact same word as man and woman, which is kind of fun because I like to be a little more literal when I'm translating, and so instead of it's her husband, it's her man or his woman. And there's been a lot of debate about that. You know, maybe it's the culture that says if you're male, born male, you're going to be a husband. If you're born female, you're going to be a wife. But that very idea of no separate words for husband and wife tells us more about how we read stories. And it comes up in a couple of other places where I think translations have gotten it wrong by using wife instead of woman. So if you're going to study pushy women in the Hebrew Bible, the only place to start is with Eve. Because, you know, those church fathers, all of you are an Eve, blah, 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 blah. She's the problem. If it weren't for Eve, we'd live happily ever after in the Garden of Eden. It's not what the story says, but that's how she has been portrayed. And so it's so much in popular culture. I have a couple examples here. This is for some curiously strong mints. You see the woman and the man, the serpent, all of those things that we think of when we think of the Garden of Eden story in Genesis 3. Or this, desperate housewives. What are they doing? They're laying in a bed of apples. Because, you know, Eve tempted Adam with the apple, right? It's like Pink Cadillac, you know that song? They say Eve tempted Adam with an apple. I'm not going for that. It was her pink Cadillac. So it's in our culture. People who know nothing about Genesis know about this. Eve and the apple. Well, sorry, folks, it's not an apple. Apples wouldn't have grown in that area. It's a fruit. Might have been a pomegranate. We don't know that they're referencing in the story, but right there you've already started wrong. This is an icon, more modern icon, that any guess about who's on the right with the blue and carrying a baby? Mary. Mary, the mother of Jesus. So who's the woman on the left? Eve. Eve often has red hair, which is a problematic thing. You have the serpent wrapped around, but notice that Mary has stepped on the serpent. You have pears, but Eve still has an apple. And notice how Eve is blushing and head down, ashamed for what she did. Well, yeah, she's got her hand on the baby, and notice that Mary's very carefully comforting her. So what does this do to us? This says that Eve is the problem. She is often portrayed as the whore, if you will, and Mary, the virgin, is forgiving Eve for getting us into trouble. And there's even a text at the end of the Genesis 3 story where it says to the serpent, you will strike at the heel of the human and they will step on your head. It's a very literal translation. Many have suggested that that's a prediction of Jesus. I haven't gotten it yet. I've been studying the Hebrew Bible for quite some time. Still can't hear Jesus in that text. But this is the great portrayal, whore and virgin. And women throughout the Bible are either a Mary or they're an Eve. Someone sent this to me thinking I would like it. I'm like, did you not interpret what's going on in here? And somebody who knows me. So anyway, so I'm going to end with a better one, which I really like. This is Hebrew Bible Barbie. reading a Torah scroll, which I like to think of as maybe Eve reading the Torah scroll. So trying to reclaim Eve, which is what I have spent many years trying to do, both in congregations and in the classroom. So let's start with what we know about Eve. Her name, Hava, means mother of all life or living, so it's a good name. She's the mother of it all. Notice that even though many people think of that she's named in Genesis 2, which is that second creation story where God creates the first human out of the dirt and breathes into its nostrils the breath of life, that first human is never distinguished as male or female until God decides that the human is lonely and splits that person in half. So now we have two, and because you've got to reproduce and fill the earth and multiply, you have to have a male and a female. An ish, man, isha, woman. But she's never named. That woman never gets a name. So that when we move into Genesis 3, she's still not named. She is woman. And she goes all the way the story till the end when Adam finally names Eve, which is a power play we'll talk about in a moment. But then later people said, oh, well, she must be the Genesis 1 woman too, because I'm sure this congregation's heard more than once that there are two creation stories in Genesis. The first one goes all of creation up to humanity, male and female, God created them. Humans, God created in God's image. And then the second one where it's about dirt and breath and animals comes second. They go back and think, well, the first woman in Genesis 1 is also Eve. It's not in the story, not how we read it. Those are two separate stories with two origins, more than likely. And so, again, until the end of chapter 3, she is woman. Sometimes his woman, meaning the man's woman, and sometimes just the woman. That has not stopped a lot of people from doing artwork, even though we don't know a lot about Eve. This is a piece. You can see the snake, the apple. This is Eve, a very discreetly placed plant. So in artwork, this idea of Eve being the tempted one, I think that shows up in the New Testament. The man was not tempted, but the woman was. Very problematic. So I'm not going to have us read Genesis 2, 4b through 25, which is that second creation story, except to point out a couple of things. One, as I just mentioned, that first human is not named Adam. The word Adam is a pun on Adamah, which means dirt, or dust. So that first creature is made of dust and is called Adam, which again, in English might be dusty from the dust, or earthling from the earth. That sounds a little sci-fi. Groundling from the ground. Or if we really think about the root of human, it's humus. The stuff of the earth, not what you dip with the bagel chip, humus. And at the end, you have these two people who are naked and unafraid. Nothing negative at all said about the two of them. They're both made from the same stuff. If that first human was not specified as male or female, it is also important to note that where it says God put Adam to sleep, and it says in many English translations, took a rib or took from its side. The Hebrew there is the word for side, like the side of a temple or the side of a calf. It's not rib. There's no rib in the story. So literally, God is putting Adam to sleep and slicing it in half so that there are now two, so Adam will not be lonely. And when they turn around, they realize there are no longer two. The rabbis had a lot of fun with this. They like to play with text. So they're like, how could that first human be neither male nor female. And so some said maybe it had both sex organs. Others said maybe it didn't have any sex organs, because that's not important until you have to reproduce. My favorite story is a rabbinic legend that said Adam was created with two sides. One was male, one was female, according to the story. And when God split them apart, they could turn around and see they were no longer lonely. So part of human existence is finding that which completes us, whatever you define that as. Kind of fun story to play around with. And then we move on from that story. One more piece of art. See the red hair, see Eve with the mirror looking very vain, all that great imagery. We get to Genesis 3, and we know the story. This serpent that was the craftiest of all the animals the divine created. Now, many people say that's Satan, but that's not in the text unless you want to say God created Satan. Even later, people who think Satan was a fallen angel would not have said that. So this serpent is there and comes up to the woman and says, "Hey, did God really say you can't eat from any tree in the garden?" The woman says, "No, we can eat from every tree except the tree in the middle of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We can't eat it or even touch it." Now the question comes up, who told her that? Some people say, well, the man told her wrong. But if that original creature was the stuff of both the man and the woman, then the woman was there when God says, don't eat from the tree. I always look at it this way. They have gotten so tempted by this tree that they can't even touch it. Imagine something you're very much tempted by. I like brownies. If they're brownies and I smell them and touch them, I will eat them. I have to hide them from myself so they're not in plain view. That's what I think is going on. You know, the woman's like, "Oh no, thank you, but we can't even touch that tree." Then the serpent says, and she said, God says, in the day that we eat of the fruit of the tree of good and evil, we will die, surely die. In the Hebrew, it's clear. It's going to be drop dead on the spot. Not some metaphorical death. It's a human death. And the serpent says, "Oh, you won't die. You'll become like God, knowing right from wrong." And so the woman, it says, saw that the tree was good for food. It was a delight to the eyes, and the tree was to be desired to make one wise. So think about it. She's not just taking the fruit and eating it. She sat there, thought about it, looked at it, made a choice. She took of the fruit and ate. She also gave some to her husband, or her man, who was with her, and he ate. Now, most translations leave out who was with her. Gave some to the husband, and he ate, which creates this lovely idea that Adam's off wandering in the garden, and Eve takes those apples, makes an apple pie. It's sitting there ready to cut when Adam comes in, and she cuts him a big slice, and he eats it, not knowing where the fruit came from. But that's not what the text says. He was with her the entire time. The whole time the serpent's talking to her. He could have stepped in and said, "Whoa, wait a minute. Nope, we will not eat from that tree." He says nothing, and he doesn't even think about eating it when he takes some of the fruit and eats it. She made an informed choice. He just did whatever was in front of him. He ate it, which a lot of my companion says at my family's gatherings early on, he ate whatever was in front of him and said nothing. So the other thing, remember in that song, Pink Cadillac, Eve tempted Adam? There's no tempt there at all. So all these images that we have been told throughout the centuries and in society are completely wrong. The woman she ate some, the man was with her, she gave it to him, he took a bite. And then what happens in the story is their eyes were opened and they knew right from wrong, and they realized they were naked and they were now ashamed, or at least realized there were some differences there that they wanted to cover up. They didn't die. Now, some people say, oh, they had a death of innocence. That's not what the Hebrew text says. So who told the truth about the tree? The serpents. Oh, no. Did the holy lie? Well, again, I like to think of the story as like, parents who say, don't touch that, you'll burn your hand off. Don't get that BB gun, you'll shoot your eye out. All those things. Not going to happen that way, but as a parent, you want to try and keep them from doing those things. I think in the story, the holy knew what would happen when they ate from the tree. They'd have a conscience. They'd be aware of what they had done right and wrong. And so tried to keep them from going there until it was time. So they eat of the tree. Their eyes are open. The holy comes along and says, man, woman, they hide. And God says, why are you hiding from me? And the man says, well, I heard you and I was scared because I was naked. And God says, why are you naked? How did you know you were naked? Have you eaten from that tree? And the man says, yes, but the woman made me. She tempted me. It's her fault. Pass the blame. And of course, remember who created the woman? He even says, the woman who you gave to me, she tempted me and I ate. So the holy says to the woman, what have you done? Well, got to blame somebody. It wasn't me, it was the serpent. Serpent fooled me. It's not my fault. The holy turns to the serpent and the serpent goes, oops, there's nobody left to blame. Now, this is a great story, and actually passing the blame is a theme throughout the Hebrew Bible, but particularly in Genesis. And so we have what people call the punishments. Man's going to work by the sweat of his brow, and nothing will come easily to him. The woman will give birth in pain, but she'll keep going back and doing what got her pregnant in the first place. And the poor serpent's going to crawl on his belly all his life, and there will be enmity between you and humans. They will strike you on the head, you will strike them on the heel. Those aren't really punishments, those are just consequences. And what the holy is describing, or the storyteller is describing, is how life already is. Why do women who have so much pain when they give birth agree to get pregnant again? Well, that's what you're supposed to do. And why is it that the promised land, as it's later referred to, doesn't grow anything easily? Well, the man, he had consequences. And you can imagine an ancient audience going, why does a serpent move but it has no legs? And most everybody I know is afraid of snakes of some sort. My oldest sister was so afraid of snakes that she couldn't even see pictures of them. And in one evening, I remember as a child sitting in the living room, my sister was back in her bedroom. All of a sudden, blood-curdling scream comes running out of her bedroom, and we're all like, oh no, what's going on? And we walk in there. She had been looking at the Encyclopedia Britannica or whatever it was, and it was open to snakes. So everybody has some fear of snakes, especially the kind of snakes that would have been in the ancient Near East. So in the end, then the man names the woman Eve because she was the mother of all living. All of that stuff is how we get the curse. The curse of Eve and the humanity's curse. But if you go back and read that Genesis 3 part at the end, the ground is cursed, the serpent is cursed. Humans are never cursed. There's no curse on humanity. And when they leave the garden, the holy does that so they won't eat from the tree of life and live forever. Because who wants to live forever knowing everything you've ever done wrong in your life? And death at that point, getting out of the garden, is actually a grace. And, oh, by the way, they didn't eat from the tree of life, so they were already mortal. Remember, they could have eaten from the tree of life and lived forever, but they chose wisdom. So they're going to die anyway, but now the Holy gets them out of the garden so they don't live forever after eating from the tree of life. The man names the woman Eve because she is the mother of all living. And in the end, many people now, women and other interpreters who are looking at different angles, say that Eve is not the fall of humanity. She is the liberator of humanity. If it hadn't been for her, we'd still be in the garden. And we'd never know what was right and wrong. We'd never have self-accountability. We would have just been these animatrons that did whatever we were told. So, any questions about Eve at this moment? Before I move on. I know I've taken a lot of time, but you got to get Eve right or the whole thing just falls apart.
It's too bad there couldn't have been at least one cat or lion in there.
I know. Yes, Eve never had cats. That's right. And she did have children. So remember that. She is not childless, or as I choose, child-free. But I'm also cat-free, so I'm really in trouble. All right, we're going to move on quickly to Miriam. I'm just going to briefly talk about Miriam. Miriam, as many will remember, is Moses and Aaron's sister. She is actually named in Exodus 15, Numbers 12, and Numbers 20. And you're like, oh, wait, when Moses was hidden in the Nile in the basket and the sister kept watch, wasn't that Miriam? The text never says it's Miriam. It just says his sister. So it could be Miriam or it could have been another sister. And it's not till Exodus 15 that we hear from Miriam. And remember, Moses does this long song after they cross the Sea of Reeds and all the Egyptians drown. And Miriam comes along and does this beautiful 2-line song that sums it all up quickly. And it says in the text that she led not just the women in song, but the whole congregation. So Miriam is a worship leader. She is known as a prophet, though she never prophesies anything in the story. In Micah 6, verse 4, she is remembered along with Moses and Aaron as one of the liberators that the Holy called as to lead the people out of Egypt. So that much later from the story's origin, probably, she is among the top 3, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. So again, I mentioned the unnamed sister of Exodus 2. Though in Numbers 26, we find out that Moses and Miriam and Aaron's mother, Jochebed, only had a daughter and 2 sons. So we could read back and say that's probably Miriam. She is most known for leading the song with tambourines after the safe passage of the Sea of Reeds. And as I said, her song is very simple. Sing to the Lord, for the Lord has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider the Lord has thrown into the sea. Now, this is how it's usually known. But as I just mentioned, the women come out with tambourines, but she leads the whole people of Israel in song. She is known in Jewish tradition as a prophet. How was she a prophet? It's not in the text, except that if we expand our prophetic definitions, leading people in celebrating the holy works in their life is a prophetic text. She also does speak truth to power. I'm going to move on to this one. Numbers 12, she shows up. They are in the wilderness. The Israelites are wandering towards promised land. And we read this text that Miriam and Aaron confront Moses for his Cushite wife. And then go on to say, has God only spoken through Moses? Well, this is an interesting text because even though it says Miriam and Aaron challenged Moses, the verb is feminine singular. So the original story probably was Miriam challenging Moses. But later, people didn't like Aaron, so they threw him in there too to make him guilty as well. We don't know who the Cushite wife is. It could be Moses' wife Zipporah. It could be that Moses had taken another wife. Why was Miriam upset about this Cushite wife? Well, if it's a second wife, then maybe he's neglected his first wife. Or some have suggested Zipporah in the story of Exodus actually circumcises someone, which makes her priestly. Her dad was a priest, and so some have suggested maybe Miriam and Zipporah are two competing females for religious leadership among the wandering Israelites. And why are they competing? Well, because most of the leaders have to be males. So when you have two women fighting for probably the one spot held for a female, the whole system puts them at odds with one another. Just a thought. And of course, when Miriam and Aaron do this, God comes down and says, Moses is my prophet. Or I like to think of it in my mother's voice. Mother, Moses is my prophet. Don't you know better? And then when the holy cloud removes, Miriam is struck with leprosy. Aaron's perfectly fine. So yet another idea that maybe Aaron wasn't in the story originally. She is struck with leprosy, which means she has to be set outside the community for a certain amount of days. But this isn't a settled community. They got to keep moving. But the text says that while she was shut out of the community for 7 days, the people would not move. It's only when Miriam joins the community again that they move on to their next stop towards the promised land. I have a theory that Moses was God's prophet. Aaron was Moses' prophet, because Aaron, was supposed to speak for Moses, who didn't like to do public speaking. Miriam was the people's prophet. She is remembered as that people's prophet because while Aaron and Moses are duking it out with the Pharaoh, who's helping take care of the people who have to get ready to leave? Who has lived in Egypt this entire time, suffering with the people? Not Moses, really not Aaron. It's Miriam. So I see Miriam as this people's prophet, and the people don't go anywhere without Miriam. And then, this is her shut out, supposedly. And then when she rejoins the story in Numbers 20, she dies. And it says after they record her death, the people have no water. Miriam was water in the story. And in fact, that's part of the reason why in more contemporary Seder services, they mention the cup of Miriam, because Miriam's well is a part of that tradition that the people have water as long as Miriam's with them. And then her death is recorded and the place she's buried, which rarely happens for women. I could count on one hand probably the number of female characters in the Hebrew Bible whose burial location is actually recorded in the text. So I always say, this woman, female character, whatever is behind the stories of Miriam, she was too important to the people to leave out of the story. And just again, since some of you may remember the sermon series on my book, Child-Free Women as Divine Agents of the Holy, Miriam is nowhere described as a wife or a man's woman, and she is never described as the mother of any children. And in fact, she dies unmarried and without children, which is supposed to be what women do, is marry and reproduce. But she's named by Micah as one of the 3 liberators of the Israelites. Being in Egypt, they did have cats before the Israelites did, so she might have had a cat. I don't know. I think probably when she was trying to I always have this image of, if I were making the movie of the Exodus, which I know there have been a couple made, But when they get to the water at the Sea of Reeds and it splits, I imagine nobody wants to go out first, right? And I have this image of Miriam stepping out. So that the people will follow, because they're not going to trust Moses. He's been gone forever. But Miriam, they will trust. Miriam, prophet, musician, worship leader, loved by the people. All right, we got 15 minutes. Any questions before I go on real quick? All right, this is the story when I told you about the changing of inheritance laws. It all comes down to the story of the Z sisters. They are the daughters of Zelophehad. They are actually 5 women who are named: Mela, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. Their story is found in Numbers 26 in a genealogy, and then Numbers 27 is the main story. So their dad, Zelophehad, we hear, has no sons, which would be sad, because who's going to inherit his land? In Numbers 27, we hear this story. They're doling out parcels of the promised land. And it's by tribe and by clan within the tribe. Who's going to get Zelophehad's land because he has no son? As I said, it'd probably go back to a brother or an uncle or some other male in the family. So what do you do in this situation? Well, in Numbers 27, it says that the daughters of Zelophehad, the Z sisters, stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the leaders, and all the congregation of Israel in the wilderness at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and they said to Moses, now think, they want to get some land, because if their dad doesn't have any land, what are they going to do? They're not married yet. They have no husband, no son. They'll have to go back to their families of origin, whatever tribe they came from, and that could be problematic too. So they need to figure something out. They go to challenge them, and they say, our father died in the wilderness, not among the company of those who gathered themselves against the Lord in the company of Korah. So he wasn't a rebel, but died for his own sin and had no sons. Why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he had no son? Give us a possession among our father's brothers. They're challenging Moses to give women land. But they don't go up in the story and say, we want our land. We have a right to this land. They couch it in very male-centered terms. You don't want our dad to lose his name in the promised land. Oh, by the way, our dad is from this tribe that goes all the way back to Joseph. You wouldn't want that. That's how they're setting this up. And Moses is a little befuddled. He decides to go to a higher judge, a higher court, to make this appeal. So he goes and asks God. And God declares that the women's plea is just, is righteous. God says they have a good point. And not only should they get land because they are the daughter of a man who has no son, God changes the inheritance laws for everybody. And from then on, if a man dies with no sons but he has daughters, they get to inherit land. That's pretty amazing. A lot of people, like to tell me that the commandments of the Hebrew Bible were set in stone, usually 2 tablets of stone. But remember, there are 613 commandments in the Hebrew Bible. And they think that they couldn't be changed, especially, only Christians, really. They think they were set and couldn't have. Here in the Hebrew Bible, we have a story that talks about changing a commandment because the situation required a different solution. Now, this is not unheard of in Judaism. It's really just Christians who want to think these commandments were so bad and we're stuck in the 10th century BCE or whatever you think. But here you have this great story. Now, unfortunately, there's a follow-up story in which the people of Zelophehad's clan go to God, or to Moses, and Moses goes to God saying, what if these daughters marry outside our tribe? Because land's supposed to stay in the tribe. And so there's a new law that says, yes, you can inherit your father's land, but you must marry within the tribe. So, not quite the liberation story that I like to believe it is, but it's a step forward that often gets overlooked when we talk about ancient Israel and how male-dominated they were. In fact, one of the scholars I read calls the daughters of, well, it's actually referring to a rabbinic tradition, the author was, that they call the daughters of Zelophehad in the interpretation of the rabbis, Zidikaniot, which means righteous. Very few people are described as righteous in the Hebrew Bible. But these 5 women get to be declared righteous. When I was first studying this story, it was, back in the days of a trial about someone, and we had a dream team. Remember the legal dream team? I think that was when OJ was being tried. This is your original dream team of adjudicators of the law. They pled their case to the highest authority and won. Pretty amazing story. And every time I try and say their names, I leave someone out. It's the craziest thing. I can't get them all in. Hogla, Tirzah, Mela, Noah, and Bilhah. Did I get that right? Let's see what we got here. Mela, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, Tirzah, Milcah. Okay. Just remember the Z sisters. We should go and be as bold as the Z sisters, and as bold as Eve, and as bold as Miriam, who may be one of the first ones to speak truth to power, right in Moses' face. Questions, comments? Because it's 5 till I don't want to keep you. Yes?
I have a question about the name Noah.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, it's considered masculine.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that had anything play into the decision that the 5 sisters could, in fact, inherit? Because it is typically seen as a masculine name. So, almost like on paper.
Huh. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that angle. I have thought about Noah as a name. And actually, what you notice about all these names is they end in AH, which is the Hebrew suffix for feminine nouns. So Noah itself is neither masculine nor feminine. It really should be more feminine, which puts a whole different spin on the Noah's Ark story, doesn't it?
And yeah, I like going back to root words.
Yeah.
Separating like the etymology of words.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
teaching the students right now too. So
Oh, good.
I was looking at Noah and I was like, well, how have we ever known
Mm-hmm.
male identifiers as Noah? So it's kind of interesting to look at.
It is. I'll look into that some more. One of the other things I remind folks is that in Hebrew, there is no neuter gender of nouns. They're either masculine gender or feminine gender. So that means in the third person pronouns, if it's a third masculine singular, it could be he or it. And in the third feminine singular, it could be she or it, which really can make a difference. But of course, since most of the early translators were male, they went for he all the time and him. But it kind of helps us when we see all these third masculine singular pronouns for the holy. We don't have to say he. We could say it. One of my Hebrew students once translated it as the divine it, capital I, capital T. Now, that makes other people uncomfortable because the holy can't be an it, and I'm not really happy with that either. But it at least helps us remember that grammatical gender, as you well know, has nothing to do with biological sex. You know, just because a table is feminine and a book is masculine doesn't mean a table is a woman. How curious, though, when we translate that third feminine pronoun for things, or the third masculine pronoun, that cars, boats, institutions, it's always she, her, whereas books, tables, it's it. And I ask my students, what do those things have in common? Cars, ships, institutions. Progress, and traditionally they've been led by men. Yeah. So if a man says, my boat, I love her, blah, 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 that's an incredible choice. Not that that person made that choice, but tradition has made that choice. So yeah, I'm all about the language stuff and etymology, and so good question. I have to look at that a little bit more. Yes?
Was that all a rabbinical creation?
Yes, and actually if we had had more time, we would have done Lilith, because it is something that always comes up with Eve. We'll come back to these. Lilith is a rabbinic midrash on one word in an Isaiah passage. And the word is translated usually as a screech owl. But the rabbis play around with these things, and it starts as early as the alphabet of Ben Sira, in which they come up with this idea that Lilith, or Lilitu, is actually the first wife of Adam in Genesis 1. Yeah. And their theory is that she, there it is, Isaiah 34:14, that she was that first female created, and she refused to submit to Adam. Now, some people, the rabbis, like to imagine things, as I said, so it's like she didn't want to be on bottom when they were having sex, and so she rebelled, and she ran away. And then God had to make that second woman, Eve. This is the rabbi's interpretation. Some rabbis, that she was the more submissive one, but the idea of Lilith develops into this ugly creature. Sometimes she's the serpent in the garden. She also is blamed for a lot of things. She becomes a baby killer. If a baby dies, like we would know today as sudden infant death syndrome, back in the early days when we didn't know about that, Lilith is said to have come and stole that baby's soul to take to birth her own demon children. And so that's why they wait till the 8th day to circumcise a child, and often there is a custom of watch night when infants are born so that Lilith can't come and steal their child. She also gets blamed for nocturnal emissions. Male nocturnal. She's stealing the seed to go make those demon babies. I particularly liked this image. This is Lilith, and this is Eve. And there's a midrashic story that says that Lilith came to Eve and said, "Come with me, I'll take you where you can be free." And she doesn't go. She's scared. Women, though, Jewish feminists first, and other women have reclaimed Lilith. This is from the Lilith Fair. If you're old enough to remember the concert with the all-female musicians and bands, that is Lilith. Or one of my other favorites, she's like a woman of mystery. Lilith is the woman who knows who she is. She's abroad, actually. She knows who she is. She does the brave thing. But yes, it's not in the Hebrew Bible. It is an attempt by later rabbis to play with the word and, in some opinions, to explain why bad things happen. And you have to blame the woman, Lilith, for those things. So she's also now an icon of women's liberation and equality. All right, I am done at 10. Thank you all very much. I will see you next week, and I don't remember what we're doing next week, but it'll be another group of women that have some common themes. Have a great day.